So we will move on to the next presentation from Sascha Clark Danylchuck. And Sascha, I'm looking for you up on my tiles, but you're welcome to start sharing your screen now.
Sure.
And I wanted to preface the talk with a little bit of background, because we've come across this topic before. When we had discussions last year with this group, there were people saying, well, what's the point of releasing fish? We're not sure if all of them are going to live. Some people were saying, we have people we know that we see out there all the time that are just dropping their fish on the rocks. And couldn't we do something to do some outreach to try to encourage people to handle fish better if they're going to release them? And this was a great opportunity, because I started to do some poking around and I found some literature related to catch and release mortality of steelhead, and Sascha's name kept popping up. And then I found out that she is the executive director of this Keep Fish Wet organization. That's, again, it's a non-governmental organization which lets them work wherever people are releasing fish. And they've come up with some best practices, and I'll let Sascha take it from there and share her story with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for having me tonight to talk. I'm going to go through some of this a little quickly, but there'll definitely be time at the end for questions if people have them. So we're a nonprofit, and we really focus on best practices for catch and release, really working kind of at a grassroots level, bottom up, as opposed to trying to change regulations and a top-down approach. So I'll talk a little bit more how that comes into play in a couple minutes, but I always like to start with a little bit of background, and this is going to be very familiar to a lot of people, but it's always good reminders. So, if we think about our recreational fisheries and some of the different types of threats that they face, they're myriad, they're complex, they're all interwoven together. And then the elephant at the bottom of the slide there is to remind people of the elephant in the room of all of this is climate change too. And we've been seeing a lot of that, especially last summer, a lot of heat waves, unexpected low water, things like that. So there's just a lot that comes into play here, and a lot of interactions that happen with some of these things that are impacting our fisheries. But if we look at conservation from a resilient standpoint, is that we want resilient fisheries. There are a number of things that we can do that overall impact the resilience of our fishery. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to do with our conservation work, is how can we relieve some stresses on a fishery so that there's more, breathing room and bandwidth, so that some of these other issues that are more complex and are going to take more time to solve, there's more space to do so. And, it's also important to remember how huge recreational fisheries are in the United States. We don't have really great numbers because it's state by state for freshwater, but really roughly, we think it's somewhere about 4 billion fish that are caught every year in the United States. It's estimated that 10% let me back up. So over half of those fish that are caught are released in the US, where about 60% of all fish that are caught recreationally are released now. And science shows that on average, about 10% of those fish die. So that's somewhere about 240 million fish that die following catch and release, and that's every year. The science on catch and release also shows that we can change that number, that it doesn't, 10% is it's really malleable. It's higher for certain fisheries, it's lower for others, and we have a difference. We can make a difference in that. So even if we could get it down 1% from 10% to 9%, that's 20 million fish that are not dying every single year. So, when you think of one stream, 1 or 2 fish sometimes doesn't seem like a lot, but as we scale up and look at the United States or the world, it's a significant number of fish that we can help save. And a lot of it really boils down to this quote: the fate of fish after release is primarily determined by angler behavior. So it's how we handle fish, how we catch fish, how we release fish that makes a difference to whether they survive and how healthy they are after release as well. And so that's where Keep Fish Wet comes in. We have taken the science on catch and release. We have it's a relatively new discipline. Most of the studies have been done in the last 30 years. Half of the studies have been done in the last decade alone. But we've taken that body of literature and pulled out the information that makes the most difference for the survival of fish. And it's most within an angler's control as well. That's really important. And so all these best practices are science-based, and they won't, if using them together makes a huge difference in the survivability and health of fish after release. It's also really important to remember that all anglers practice catch and release, whether it's voluntary or mandated. The way that many of our regulations are set up in the US with size limits and closed seasons or slot limits, that means that some anglers are always releasing at least some fish. So this doesn't only apply to fisheries where fish are being released. It definitely applies to harvest fisheries as well. That being said, we feel like it's really important to talk about, what we stand for and what we don't stand for. We're not advocating that fish should only be caught and released. We're just talking about situations where fish are caught and released. We recognize that a lot of fish are harvested, and I don't want to give up eating fish yet. So, so this is we're not trying to mandate catch and release. It's also not just a fly fishing practice. We have a lot of our roots kind of in the fly fishing community, but these best practices can be used with any type of fishing, any type of fishery. And the other couple things is that we recognize that fish have to come out of the water sometime, just depending on circumstances. So we're not trying to advocate for fish being in the water all the time, but we do talk about some tips and tricks that if you're going to take fish out of the water, how to do that as safely as possible for you and for the fish. So as we go into it, in a very, very basic sense, you catch a fish, there's a couple different potential outcomes that it can have. A is the most ideal here. It's a healthy, happy fish and swims away and goes on to live a normal life with almost no impacts at all. Situation B would be a least desirable outcome. That was a bonefish that was attacked by a shark after it was released. And then situation C here is a fish that loses equilibrium. And this really gets into sublethal impacts of catch and release, that you can have things that won't kill a fish, but maybe have some short or long-term impacts on a fish. It could be things like deep hooking and causing more of a wound that bleeds a little bit and then recovers really quickly. It could be stressing the fish out more and making it more susceptible to disease. And it could even go as far to have, reproductive impacts and change the fitness of the fish. So there's a whole slew of things that fit into category C, those sublethal impacts. And a lot of them just depend on the situation and the species as well. But those are kind of the three different potential outcomes. So it's not just live or die, but there is that category C over there, which is important to remember as well. So as I mentioned, we've taken all the science on catch and release and distilled it down into best practices. And the way that we have organized our best practices is that there are 3 principles. These are the main things that people can do to make a difference. And then we have a series of more specific tips that anglers can use that are kind of fishing situation dependent sometimes, or not always applicable. But so it's really the principles which if you can employ those 3 principles is going to make the biggest difference to the health and survival of fish after release. So our first principle, not surprising given our name, is to minimize air exposure. And most of the science on air exposure says that for most species, 10 seconds or less is a good rule of thumb. And 10 seconds is a decent amount of time. You can get a pretty good picture out of the water in 10 seconds. You can get a hook out of a fish's mouth. You can do, for the most part, what you need to do to release a fish or get your photo within 10 seconds, but it's starting to be conscious of that time. And this really goes to fish gills and how they work and you know, how fish breathe and how they get oxygen. So the science is kind of on a range, and it's species and location dependent onto how impactful air exposure is for fish. And thinking about, you know, as you're lifting a fish out of the water, especially after you've just angled it, that fish has undergone exercise. So it's like being forced to run a mile as fast as you can, and then you're taking the fish out of the water so it's not able to breathe, which is akin to maybe somebody sticking your head in a bucket of water. So just at the time when that fish needs oxygen the most to recover from the exercise event, you're essentially depriving it of oxygen by taking it out of the water. But, you know, 10 seconds or less, and then that's total. It's, you know, you can't do 10 seconds and put it back in the water and another 10 seconds. It's 10 seconds total of air exposure or less is usually okay for fish. And the other thing that happens when we remove fish out of from the water is the gill filaments, the lamellae, those kind of pink fingery it's kind of, they're, you know, they almost look like tentacles sort of on the gill filaments. They are covered in a mucus. So when you take fish out of the water, they can collapse and adhere together. So when you put fish back in the water, not only have you first deprived them of oxygen, but then their gills aren't functioning at 100%, at least for a short period of time. So it's kind of a double whammy there. Our second principle is to eliminate contact with dry, and I always add or hard or rough surfaces. And this goes into fish slime and scales. And fish slime, fish need their slime the way we need our skin. It protects them from disease and infection. And so anything we can do to minimize the amount of slime loss makes a big difference. Things like using clean, bare, wet hands as opposed to tailing gloves whenever possible. Using rubber nets makes a big difference. And then just thinking about how you're holding fish, not bringing them into boats if possible, and cradling them gently. I see it more in Europe, but there's kind of this tendency with salmonids to like grip their bellies really hard. So holding them gently in your hands is going to make a big difference for those sorts of things. Our third principle is to reduce handling time. And this is really anything you do from a fish to landing, from landing to release, whether it's in a net or in your hands. That's essentially a wild animal that you're caging. And so that restraint of the fish is a stressful situation for them. And as quickly as possible as we can get a fish off and swimming again, it's going to be best for it, especially after undergoing that experience of forced exercise through angling. So a couple ways to do this is where using barbless hooks makes a difference. A lot of studies have shown that it's just much faster to release a fish if you use barbless hooks. Having some sort of a hook removal device, whether that's just a pair of pliers or hemostats, but something besides your fingers to remove a hook, makes a difference. And then only reviving fish that can't swim on their own. But if a fish can swim, let it go, and as opposed to holding it. We see a lot of anglers holding fish into a current or something like that. And we don't have much evidence that that actually makes a big difference in their recovery. So it's probably better just to let them go. So those are the three principles: minimize air exposure, eliminate contact with dry surfaces, and reduce handling times. As I mentioned, those make the biggest difference in fish health and survival after release. We do have a number of tips, and these are kind of more specific. Some of these I've talked about already, but these kind of reinforce and support a lot of those principles as well. And so there's more information about these as well on our website. We go through in more detail both the principles and the tips. So if you have questions or are curious about some of these are all up on our website. The other thing we always like to talk about is temperature, just because it's such a significant factor in fish biology and ecology. Scientifically, we call it the master factor. It really impacts everything that a fish does. And so, you know, as temperatures start to rise in the summer, obviously not this time of year is not a concern, but, you know, we do see all those impacts of catch and release being exacerbated by higher water temperatures. So something to keep in mind that when temperatures get kind of to the high end of a species range, that it's even more important to think about best practices because those fish are kind of starting from a very different place than when temperatures are lower. And then the last thing we always like to talk about is photography. And, you know, as I mentioned, we're not, you know, we don't want to tell anglers never to take a photo of their fish, because we know that's a really, really important part of the angling experience. It's part of why people enjoy going out fishing. But there are different things that you can do that make a big difference when you're trying to get a photograph of your fish. You know, one of them is now we have all these great devices and things that we can use to get underwater photos of fish. So you don't even have to take them out. The casing on the top left there is an Access Go, and it holds an iPhone. And it allows you to get really great underwater photographs and even split shots like that one to the right of the woman in the hat with the red bill. So the angler can be above water, but the fish can be underwater. And it's that big dome lens on the front that allows you to do that. But even, you know, I've seen anglers, you know, even use a Ziploc bag, even low tech options can really make a difference for getting good photos. And then just thinking about being prepared, making sure that all your photo gear is accessible and you're ready to take a picture, so it doesn't take 10 minutes to go climbing through your bag to try to get the things you need, makes a big difference. And the last point here is just to really be mindful of of conditions. As I mentioned, with warm water temperatures, that might be times where you're less likely to take a picture or want to rethink taking a picture. Situations where there's predators around is another one for, just being more aware. Or if, for instance, a fish is deeply hooked and already bleeding a little bit, from the gullet or the gills, that might be a time you want to forego taking photos as well. So that concludes what I'm going to go through. We are not a membership-based organization. We are believe that all this information should be free and available to anybody who wants it. So there's a lot of more information on our website, and we even dig into a lot of the science as well. We translate a lot of the catch and release science. So the primary literature is there available, and then translations are available as well on our website. We do have an advocate program, which is just a pledge to use best practices. So you can sign up for that on our website if you're interested. And I see there's a question here about the Access Go. And it looks like somebody got that in there. I can put the website in as well. They're not cheap, but they're really, really fantastic for taking underwater photographs. So, yeah, with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions that people have, and I'll take my share screen off.
Yeah, I'll start. That was great, thanks. And I was wondering if you could also speak to some of the work you've done on post-release mortality of steelhead. I know that's come up, people just wondering if there's some good information out there from other systems that folks in the Great Lakes might not be aware of. Yeah.
So most of that research was actually done by my husband, who's a fisheries scientist, but I'm familiar with it. And it's looking at, a lot of it was done in BC as well. Yeah, there's, one of the big questions that they initially looked at besides survival was looking at how you land a fish and if there's a difference between like tail grab or netting fish. And they didn't find a difference in mortality rates about whether you tail grab a fish or land it in a net. There's a little bit of a difference in the amount of stress that fish have endured. You can land a fish faster if you net it than if you tail grab it, but those fish tend to be a lot more green, so they obviously harder to handle. But mortality rates for those two things are pretty similar. And then long-term mortality rates were pretty good. They were looking at mainly fly fishing, but there was a little bit of other types of fishing in there as well. But mortality rates were, I think, 5% or less. So for the most part, it's pretty good.
Yeah, that was the number that was stuck in my head as I was trying to recall that. And I see Adam also had a question about the 10 seconds out of water, and if there was a study or citation you had for a study that looked at multiple durations and the impacts of multiple durations.
Yeah, so it's very species specific, the air exposure work. It's hard to even compare across salmonids sometimes for that air exposure work. So it would sort of depend on what species you're looking at. And there's a couple studies that looked at kind of multiple air exposures. But most of the studies, when they're measuring air exposure, they haven't, it's cumulative. So they've always looked at total air exposure, whether that's repeat experiences or one single experience. I'm not sure of any studies that have looked at, for example, 30 seconds in all at once versus 2 15-second air exposures to see if there's any difference there. But but yeah, for most species, that 10 seconds rule is what seems to have come out as being okay, as being safe in most situations. Does that answer your question?
That one was typed in. And we also have another typed in question.
I'll just jump in on microphone then.
All right.
Hey, Dan. All right. So yeah, it was some sort of study that I read. It was a while back. It was like 10 seconds had like a 95% survival rate. Once you got to 20 seconds, it was like an 85%. And of course, once you got to like a minute, it was like a 90% death rate or something like that. I can't recall what it was or where I came across that. I was trying to research it recently for a buddy of mine, and I couldn't find it. So I was just wondering if she had it handy.
Yeah, it might be. There's one of the first studies that was done on air exposure found that I think it was a minute had like a 60% mortality rate of air exposure. But the techniques that they use to measure that, they afterwards they realized that they were probably killing some fish because they had the way that they were cannularized, they were taking blood measurements as well. So that may be the study that you're talking about. It gets talked about a lot because, 60 seconds and 60% of our fish are dying. It's on rainbow trout. This is horrible, but it gets kind of taken out of context. So that might be the one that you're thinking of. And that's up on our webpage kind of with some of those qualifiers as well. We have a series called Fin Sites where we translate the science, and that's one of the first Fin Sites if you go to that. So yeah, you could check that out. I'll see if I can find the link too.
Yeah, the website has a ton of great information if you check that out, keepfishwet.org. And we have one more written in question from Joe. You touched on fish handling. Any insight into gilling fish versus a proper hold?
Yeah, don't touch the gills. Keep your fingers away from the gills. They're just really, really sensitive organs. And as much as we can not touch them at all, it's going to make a really big difference. So I know there's some anglers, I see this a lot with like muskie, especially, and other really toothy fish where, sometimes anglers get really good at just holding the operculum. Get my rubber fish here. His operculum don't open, but they get really good at holding the gill flap and not touching the gill membranes. So I see that sometimes with muskie, but and maybe pike sometimes, a big pike, but it's really best just to keep your fingers away from the gills if you can, and not unless you're harvesting the fish, then it doesn't matter. But if you're going to release a fish, keeping your fingers away from the gills as much as possible.
And one more thing I wanted to touch on after looking at the website is your ambassadors section, where you have a lot of well-known anglers. Is that something that people get involved in if they want? Because I don't think I saw anyone from the Great Lakes region on the Keep Fish Wet ambassadors.
Yeah, we've got one person from Ohio, but that's the closest. Yeah, and we are actually changing up our ambassador program in the next in 2020. So hopefully in the beginning of the year. So we are going to make it more open. It's kind of been by invitation only, but we really want to recognize, especially people who are professionally working with fish in one capacity or another. So we're going to open up that program a lot. So stay tuned. We'll have some information about that on social media and other things too. So yeah, for sure. The ambassador program is a great place. And I see one more question about tailing gloves too, that I think came in as a direct message here. We don't have a lot of science on tailing gloves, but anything that's going to remove slime from a fish, so any rough surface, and a lot of those tailing gloves, whether they're cotton or that mesh, are more rough. are more likely to remove slime. So if you don't need a tailing glove to protect your hands, which you don't for salmonids, we try to encourage people not to use tailing gloves because they do remove a lot of slime when you're holding fish. So yeah.
Great. I appreciate it. It's been a great discussion.